So we've heard about ants just then, now on to onts, which are a much more, slightly different form of species in the philosophical world. So first of all, thanks very much to Chad and Vary for inviting me to speak today. In my paper, I want to examine the notion of heterarchy as it intersects with the question of ontology. And by that I mean what actually exists in the world, what the world is. As you'll know, and as we've heard about already today, heterarchy is normally a way of thinking through social structures that offers an important alternative to notions of hierarchy. Proposing the notion that power can operate differently in different spheres, it suggests a route to thinking about social structure in a way that is potentially much less reductive than approaches rooted in hierarchy sometimes allow. In a similar sense, I want to suggest questions of ontology in archaeology have tended to operate hierarchically, both in traditional archaeology, which is privileged a modernist Cartesian ontology, but also that more radical approaches associated with the ontological turn have tended to end up simply replacing one ontology at the top of the tree with another, replacing naturalism, as Descartes defines the dominant Western ontology, with animism. And we could add totemism, but it's basically always animism that gets added up there instead. So in contrast to this, I want to suggest we can build on the notion that John Robb and I have proposed elsewhere, that ontologies can exist heterarchically. In doing so, I think we can open up the possibility for more radically complex and interesting pasts. If I have a moment at the end, I will pose some questions about what a methodology that would allow us to do this might require. My original plan for the paper was to have sort of two halves, one saying ontological heterarchy, and the second half talking about how that would work. But I showed the draft of it to my colleague Rachel Crellin, and she described it as batshit crazy. So, apologies. I decided to kind of strip out that second half of it and kind of cut it down to a series of enigmatic questions towards the end. So I'll come back to that in very broad brush terms as we get to the end of it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's set the ground for our argument out a little more clearly. As I'm sure many of you know, questions of ontology have been at the heart of important recent debates in both archaeology and anthropology. The writings of Marilyn Strathern and Eduardo Viveras de Castro. Through their writings, anthropologists have begun to question why it is that whilst it seems that we Westerners knew how the world worked, natives only held beliefs about it. How could it be that natives thought that a shaman could turn into a jaguar, or they believed that some of the stones around them were alive, whilst we knew they were wrong? This traditional line of thinking contrasting scientific knowledge with indigenous belief remains very prevalent. If you want an example of that, if you go and look at the recent issue of Archaeological Dialogues, the article by Toril Christine Lindstrom on agency precisely contrasts this difference between what really happens, we know about, and what other people think or attribute happens in the world. So it's a very prevalent idea still. Now, in contrast to this, these anthropological writings and others have drawn on the emergence of a new animism, emphasising the philosophical potential and the ontological reality of other people's worlds. Building on Viveras de Castro in particular, Martin Holbrad and others have argued that traditional approaches have reduced ontology, questions of ontology, to issues of epistemology instead. And through doing so, they've denied the possibility for alterity, for radical difference. We've done violence to these other worlds out there. A critical publication in this was the 2007 edited volume, Thinking Through Things, that appears on the screen there. In his paper in the volume, Holbrad uses ache, the powder used by Cuban diviners, to explore what the world would mean, what our world would be like, if we took their claim seriously, the claim of Cuban diviners, that powder is power. No metaphor, no symbolism, no representation. Powder is power. If we accept this, he points out, if we grant this claim ontological weight, then Cartesian dualisms between concept and thing collapse, and new possibilities for the world emerge. We begin to consider differences as ontological, and thus real, rather than epistemological, and thus a matter of belief. These are powerful and important ideas with both ethical and intellectual consequences. And they've been taken up by many authors in archaeology in different ways, from Chantal Canella through to Ben Alberti and Yvonne Marshall. Alberti and Marshall, for example, explore in a similar fashion to Holbrad what would happen if first millennium AD Argentinian body pots were bodies. Not models of bodies, not depictions of bodies, or representations of bodies, actual bodies. However, these approaches tend to argue for the replacement of one ontology with another, rather than giving the weight to the possibility of multiple ontologies, the potential that more than one ontology exists at any particular moment in any person's life. What happens to the Cuban diviner as they go about their daily lives in present-day Cuba? Are they locked solely in an ontology where powder is power, or do other possibilities present themselves? This is the line of argument that John Robb and I expounded in our 2012 paper in American Anthropologist. Drawing on our work looking at the long-term history of the body that developed through the Body Project at Cambridge, which Simon Stoddart at the back was a member, John and I suggested that what characterises human engagement with the world are multiple ontologies, and that these are not necessarily hierarchically organised, but rather are instead structured heterarchically. I'll return to this point in a moment. The ontological critique, though, is not restricted to development of ideas rooted in animism, of course. Symmetrical archaeology, for example, is committed to an ontological examine of archaeological approaches to the world. And here I want to make a distinction that I would, if I had more time, I'd expound on more lengthily. That we can divide symmetrical archaeology into two distinct phases. Early symmetrical archaeology, for example, the collection of articles in World Archaeology in 2007, was extensively influenced by Bruno Latour, whose recent book makes it very clear, is very sympathetic to the idea of multiple ontologies. It's a book about multiple ontologies. More recently, however, there has been a tendency by symmetrical archaeologists to draw more explicitly on the work of speculative realism and object-orientated ontology, particularly through the writings of Graham Harman. This move has seen symmetrical archaeology turn away from the potential of multiple ontologies implicit and more recently explicit in Latour's work, towards a non-relational approach that celebrates the withdrawn essences of objects that emerges in Harman's reading of Heidegger. This, in turn, is problematic, not only because it proposes a singular dominant ontology, objects have essences, but also because it denies our potential to explain history or to trace the development of relations through time. In contrast, Chris Fowler and I have argued in a paper published in Journal of Material Culture earlier this year that we need to be able to work between different ways of understanding objects, both as temporally bounded entities and ongoing processes of becoming. Our approach thus offers another avenue towards multiple ontologies. So let's take a breath here and summarise where we've got to so far. A critical realisation in the 2000s has been that as a discipline, archaeology needs to take ontology seriously. That we need to think explicitly about what archaeological entities are and how different ontologies exist in the world. The tendency has been, however, both in the explicit ontological critique developed in anthropology and imported into archaeology via Alberti and others, and in the later phases of symmetrical archaeology, to simply replace one ontology with another. Even models based in the work of Philippe Descola, which proposes 4 different forms of ontology, still tend to argue that in any one context, only a single ontology will be operating. And it's interesting to listen to Chris's paper yesterday, and I can see him shaking his head. We started having an argument about this over lunch. But I think there's a difference between a weak and a strong form of ontological approaches. And I think Descola's work is quite a weak version of ontology. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean in how firmly he thinks about it in comparison with what Viveris de Castro and another Amerindian or Amazonian-focused anthropologist is saying. But that is a debate that I haven't got time to get into now. So we can come back to it later if you want to, or rather Chris and I can shout about it later, which will be fun. In contrast then, let's explore what ontological heterarchy can offer us in a little more detail. As noted above, the need for ontological heterarchies became clear to me as part of a wide-ranging study of the history of the human body, looking at the complexity of how the human body operates, how it grows and changes through life, how it interweaves with material things, places, architecture and art, how it is buried in different ways at different times, demands that we adopt an approach that is non-reductive. That is an approach that does not insist the body is a singular thing. As Anne-Marie Moll has argued in her study of medical technologies, the body today is multiple, and that is something we can extend into the study of other periods, as I will sketch out in a moment. The critical point about the nature of multiple bodies, as we will see, is that the differences are not simply epistemological, that is, they are different understandings of a single real body, but rather ontological. That is, these differences produce actually different bodies. In turn, this means that for multiple bodies, we need multiple ontologies. These multiple ontologies are what Bruno Latour calls modes of existence. All very well, of course, but how about an example of this? Well, I'll choose one of my favourite ones, which comes from looking at early modern bodies. If you look at early modern Britain, we can trace at least 4 different modes of existence in which the body was caught up. The first mode is the religious one. Building on medieval distinctions between body and soul, but discussing them in a post-Cartesian universe, theologians like William Sherlock, the chap on the screen here, went around decrying the body. It was a disgusting, sin-ridden sack, and whatever happened to it after death was of little interest to anybody. Here we find an ontology where the body is repellent in all ways. The second mode is what we might term the social body. Here, in contrast to the religious ontology, how you dressed and presented yourself was critical both in life and in how the body was memorialised in death. But not only this. Not only could the body be cared for in death, it could also be punished. Following the Murder Act of 1752, homicide was marked out as such a special crime that it required not only the infliction of death on the body, but subsequently its destruction either through gibbeting, as a gibbet on the screen there, or through dissection. This was understood as severe enough a punishment that family members of the executed criminal would sometimes storm the scaffold after execution in an attempt to seize the body before it was taken off by the anatomist's black guards, which is the origin of the term blackguard. Within this ontology, the social body could thus be decorated in life and celebrated or punished in death, whatever theologians like Sherlock might have to say about it. The third mode would be scientific bodies. Here the body was increasingly anatomised, explored and analysed. Under the focus of Foucault's clinical gaze, the body changed from a vessel for the four humours to a functioning machine where the heart, as William Harvey declared in 1616, was a pump, and the tendons were levers and so on. From this perspective, the hidden secrets of the body could be revealed through inspection. Open up a few corpses, said Xavier Bichat, the founder of modern pathology, and the airy wisdom of the ancients will disappear. The last mode of the body, that's William Harvey down there, which captures that, and that's an autopsied skeleton from Barton-on-Humber on the far side of the screen. The last mode of the existence for the body in this period is what we might term the folk ontology. Here we see the permeable body under the threat from witches and devils. We see how the hand of an executed criminal could be applied to the body to cure people of neck complaints, or how, dipped in wax and holding a candle, it could be carried round a house at night to ensure one's burglary went undetected. Each of these modes, though, and this is the really critical one, I think, does not simply represent a different understanding of the body, however. On the contrary, they have significant social, material and historical implications. They affect how bodies can act and how they can engage in the world. They affect what bodies are. They are also much more than differing views held within a society by differing people. William Harvey, he of the heart as a pump, body as machine argument, fully believed the dead man's hand could hold curative powers. William Sherlock, he of feed my disgusting body to the crows, I don't care what happens to it when I'm dead, is buried in all pomp and circumstance at St. Paul's. These different ontologies are not arranged hierarchically. One does not dominate the others or insist that others defer to it. Rather, instead, this is an ontological heterarchy, with different elements dominant in different moments and different spheres of life. Of course, this is just one example of many I could have chosen. Even sticking just with the body, we could have looked at how different ontologies operate in the classical world, from the partible body of votives to the boundaried regulatory ideal of sculpture. Or we could have thought about how in Neolithic Britain we may be able to tease out multiple ways of having a body, ways that are at times permeably caught up in the flows of substances between people, pots, places and animals, and at other times are partible, disclosed in the fracturing of the body after death. In many times and many places it seems that multiple ontologies coexisting are the norm, and that in many cases these are caught up in relations of heterarchy. Why then have archaeologists tended towards an argument that seeks to delineate a single ontology? Why then did naturalism dominate for so long with its bifurcations, dualisms and essentialisms, only to be challenged more recently by animism or symmetrical archaeology? This cannot be because we live in a world where only a single ontology exists. As Leicester has demonstrated, there are multiple modes of existence in the modern period too, from those concerned with science to those of religion, law, living beings, fiction, to name just a few. There are 14 or 18, I forget how many different modes of existence Leicester identifies in his new book. What we see today then, and indeed can see in other periods in the past, is not a singular ontology, but rather an attempt from one ontological perspective to dominate the others, to move from relations of heterarchy, each ontology in its place, to hierarchy, one ontology to rule them all. In the modern world, it is science, with a capital S, I emphasise, that clearly plays this role. In the medieval period, religion attempted to exert its authority over other worlds that might exist, whether ones that emphasise life and vitality, or ones focusing on science and the cosmos. This attempt for a singular mode of existence to dominate others thus has an interesting history, from religious groups in the Middle Ages, via the atheist scientists of today, perhaps even to those advocating a single alternative ontology for a particular period of the past. The argument I've made in this paper has been straightforward and has developed in three stages. First, I argued that recent moves to develop an ontological critique have sought to replace one particular ontology with another. Secondly, that we're better off thinking about multiple ontologies, and in particular, these are often situated in relations of heterarchy. Third, the attempt to deny this and insist on a singular ontology is a tradition of thought going back, off and on, to medieval times, and one enhanced and mastered in the modernist era. Heterarchy provides the critical tool for exploring the complexity of relationships between ontologies in both the present and the past. The final question then is, how do we go about recognising and identifying multiple ontologies in the past? This is the part of the talk that I realised I didn't really have time to properly address. Thanks, Rach. So all I will do here is sketch the very vaguest outline. It seems to me that whilst ethnographic parallels are always useful, especially as they provoke us to question our own assumptions, they can tend to lead us to discover that some modes of the same modes of existence in the past. So if we use Amazonian parallels, we discover animism. If we rely too heavily on Melanesia, everything becomes partable. What we need then is to base our approach to ontology in a methodology that is open-ended, that allows us to explore new concepts. Indeed, it needs to be an approach in which concepts are thought of precisely as the tools we need to think differently with. We need an approach that emphasises how the world grows and changes, how it becomes. We need an approach that allows us to think through how different materials, people, places, animals and things can come together and forge novel possibilities, and how these gatherings, we might say assemblages, can coexist with and occupy the same space as other collectives. This means we might need to think through space not only in our standard Euclidean ways, but also topologically, to think about how space bends and folds. We need an approach that encourages us to follow lines of thought and lines of action as they interweave, one that embraces meaning but not as a separate realm. We need a philosophy that can carry us away on a line of flight to new possibilities and to new places. And if thinking about ontologies in the plural in the past is about anything, it will be thinking about the reality of difference. Difference as not the presence or absence of similarity, but rather difference as a process in itself, exactly what Penny was talking about in her discussion of the LBK earlier on. We need a philosophy not rooted in the hierarchy of linear thinking, but in the messy heterarchy of the rhizome. Indeed, what if we could find these resources in thinking that has explicitly inspired the very anthropologists who have led us to question ontology itself? Who or what could provide all of this? The answer, of course, is the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, but that's a story for another time. Thank you very much.